What is hope and how is it related to love? What is the difference between the singular hope and the plural hopes? What analogy does he use to explain the difference between hope and hopes? Explain the analogy. How does the death play into the analogy? Who is the summit of hope? Which biblical character does he use to best explain the summit of hope? What verse indicates he experienced the summit of hope? Church B, your question is, in the first chapter of The Burning Bush, Father Lev Jalais gives multiple meanings of the vision of the burning bush. Specifically, he gives two of what he calls secondary meanings, one historical, and then he gives the primary meaning of the burning bush, which he makes the subject of the rest of the book. Explain the historical meaning of the burning bush. Explain how the historical meaning applies to us. Explain the other secondary meaning of the burning bush. Explain the essential meaning of the burning bush that he gives.
So there's a big capital hope, and that's the hope that we're supposed to have for God and the afterlife, and the everlasting life and the love that He'll give us in that afterlife. But then the plural hopes is like the tiny little things that we hope for from day to day. Like, for example, like if you hope for a new bicycle, if you hope to do well on an exam, if you hope to be cured, if you hope for something that happens to you from day to day. Those are the little hopes, that the lowercase hopes. So what analogy does he use to explain the difference between hope and hopes? The particular analogy that he uses several of them, but the one that stands out is the one about the curve. There's this curve that basically approaches infinity. It's outbound. And that curve is representing the fact that the hope that we have in God reaches infinity. It's a limitless type of hope. But then on that same curve is all these tiny little curves that go up and down like sort of sine waves, and those represent the everyday hopes that we have. Like, for example, like in scale to the larger hope that we're supposed to have in the limitless love of God, these tiny little things such as hope for a new car or hope for a better exam don't really mean anything, or should not mean anything compared to this limitless hope that we're supposed to have in God's love. How does the death play into the analogy? So in that same chapter, he writes about how most people mistake the fact that like they make these little hopes the most important thing in their lives, and they really value them so much. And like the reason is because we worry so much about material, like we worry so much about this world, and we worry so much about like what we're achieving in this world, that we neglect or we don't realize that it's the afterlife that should be our greatest hope. It's the love of God that is to come that should be our greatest hope. And death is actually the gateway into that afterlife. It's the beginning of life. That's how he quotes it in the book. And the reason that we worry about that is, the reason that we forget that fact is because first, we're materialistic, and we're scared to just not have everything. We want everything. And then the second reason is he goes like, sometimes you're scared of people who are atheists, who believe that religion is the opium of the people. He basically means that by the opium of people, he means like atheists would call us our belief in the afterlife like a drug that just basically satisfies our needs but doesn't really mean anything. So we don't have hope because we don't want to be like mocked by those people. What is the summit of hope? So the summit of hope is actually, the summit, because the summit is actually a part of the mountain. It means the top part of the mountain. So the summit of hope is like the topmost type of hope that you could have. It's like the hope that you can have when you feel nothing except suffering and despair. And like it's the last minute type of hope. And the biblical reference that he gives right under that, on that same page, is Abraham. And in Genesis 20, he says, Abraham had hope against hope. He who had hope against hope. And like, it doesn't explain in the book why he had hope against hope, but it's basically because Abraham had to up and leave his family and go to the land of Canaan, and he trusted in this God who he didn't know anything about.
Explain the historical meaning of the burning bush. Moses needed to be aware of his vocation. The children of Israel were under oppression in Egypt, and God had pity on them. In Exodus 3:7 and 3:8, it says, "I have seen the affliction of my people. I have heard their cry. I know their sorrow, and I will come down and deliver them." The bush, thus to Moses, represented the sufferings of the children of Israel under foreign oppression, and the fact that the bush was blazing, but it was on fire, but it was not consumed, expresses The divine protection forms a symbol of love and liberation. B, how does the historical meaning apply to us? To us, in times of suffering, we may feel burned and maimed. But the vision of the burning bush reassures us that the fire will never devour us or destroy us, but rather there's a supreme reality that is hovering over us during our Holocaust and takes our part in it. This other secondary meaning of the burning bush is that the burning bush is a symbol of purification. The bush was not a large flower, like a large tall tree or a flowering plant fragrant with smell, but it was just a large shrub, untidy. It was very ugly. But for our purposes, Lev Gillick calls it a weed. Okay, so okay, so as the weed was burning. Noxious weeds represent our soul when it's abandoned to sin. So as the weeds were burning, but yet they were not consumed, gives us a meaning that the weeds, which represent our soul abandoned to sin, are purified by the divine fire. So what we have to do is throw our broken branches and our thorns and all our dead trees into that fire so that it can be purified. D, the essential meaning of the burning bush that he gives. Okay, the deepest meaning of the burning bush is that the bush is the visible expression of the very nature of God, as the bush symbolizes the divine essence. There are two things, a fire and the bush that is not consumed by the fire. The fire is God. God is the fire. Is he a fire of anger, a fire of destruction? Although in the Old Testament it may seem that way, it is not. God is the devouring fire, a divine fire that has a passion for self-propagation and demonstrates the charity of God's love.
The question 2 goes to Church B first. Okay. Your question is, as they are discussing the topic of suffering, Strobel asks, do suffering and evil contain the potential for good? How does Kreeft reply? Strobel uses a quote by Templeton in which he uses Jesus' own words to ask how God could emotionally tolerate the ongoing onslaught of pain and suffering. What is Templeton's argument? Please explain in detail how Kreeft responds to this question. What practical conclusion does he draw from this concerning suffering? And the question for Church A is, when bringing up the photo of the African woman, again to Kreeft, Strobel asks, what would you say to her? What was Kreeft's response and why? What interesting point does he make about the problem of suffering? What does theologian James Stewart add to this point? When asked why this is so, Kreeft elaborates on this topic using 2 examples. Please describe them in detail and explain how they relate to the problem of suffering. How does he use Job to further illustrate his point?
So first question is, he asks, do suffering and evil contain the potential for good? And Kreeft replies, bluntly, yes, there is. But for that to happen, it relies on the free will which God gives us. Free will allows us to make the choice to actualize the potential to make the good out of the suffering, or out of the evil and suffering. And then Strobel uses a quote by Templeton. He says, how can God emotionally tolerate the ongoing sorrow of pain and suffering? And what is Templeton's argument? Templeton argues, he refers back to the northern African woman who is suffering, and he says, how can God look upon his own children and see the suffering, and how can he tolerate it? And how can someone who is all loving and so much love for his children see it and tolerate it? It doesn't seem logical. But the response is very interesting. The response is not, he doesn't answer how. He says he did. Period. He endured that suffering for us. It's not a matter of how he did it. The fact is he did. He went up on the cross and he bore a suffering that was beyond the physical suffering that we could never endure. He bore a suffering of sin. He bore the sin of the world. He took up all the sin rolled up from the time of Adam and Eve and even till today. And it was all rolled up, and he swallowed that burden of sin. So the answer is not in an explanation, but rather it is in an action. Uh, okay, and then Kreeft uses some examples to illustrate this so we can understand it. He says, first, he talks about what is good versus what is good to God is not always good for us. So, for example, he says, what we think is good, or how God should treat us with goodness, is not God's version. If you talk to any dentists, any doctors, they will agree that kindness does not equal goodness. In the same way, we can see an example he brings up of his own daughter. He says, "My daughter was in brownies, and she was working on this needle thing, and she kept poking herself, and she kept hurting herself. And he's peering over like from outside the room, and he's seeing her hurting herself, and his instinct is to jump in. His instinct is to jump in and prevent her from hurting herself because this is his daughter. But he knows that she will learn when he just stays back, and she will learn from this experience. So the story goes, she comes out of the room and says, "Daddy, look, I did it. I did a needle thing." And because of letting her go through that suffering, she was able to take benefit of that. So what is the practical conclusion that he draws from suffering? So the purpose of suffering is repentance, he says. And what is repentance? Repentance is reconciliation with God. And what's reconciliation with God? Oh, sorry, that's the main purpose of repentance. But there's also a secondary purpose of repentance. The truth is, suffering serves, like we saw in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, there's a cycle. God punishes, people complain, they say, "God, why?" And then God saves them. And it's a cycle that occurs. And the truth is, we learn from this that we learn the hard way. So, one, we can see that you build moral character. As St. Paul says in Romans, he says, suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. So this suffering builds up moral character. But, like I said before, this is only a secondary purpose. The primary purpose is reconciliation with God. So what's reconciliation with God? Reconciliation with God is being with God. So we have to ask, where was God? So let's take it back from even creation. So God creates a perfect world, untarnished from sin. And he says, "Okay, I've made it for you, and now just keep it." But of course, we being human beings, we fall into the sin, and we tarnish his creation. Now, a just God, who's 100% just, could say, "Well, you messed up, so I'm going to take myself out, and this is your mistake, so I won't do anything." But no, he went beyond justice. He practiced more than he preached. He was so winsome in the fact that he came down the cross and he suffered for us. He carried the cross. He carried the cross, which was unbearably unjust. It did not make sense. We should have bore that cross, but we didn't. He bore with us. So what does that tell us? That tells us God is where there is suffering. God was on the cross. God was in that vulgar scene where there was flying insects, where there was blood, where there was death, where there was criminals. And God went there. God went to this place of suffering. Okay, so this means that we must also go to the place of suffering to be with God.
The African woman, again to Kreeft, Strobel asks, what would you say to her? What was Kreeft's response and why? Kreeft responded by saying, I would say nothing to her. He would just hear her out. Because those who are in suffering, they gain a lot from their pain. They grow in it. They become closer to Christ. They welcome his presence into their lives. That's why he would hear the woman out, and he would just absorb exactly what it is she went through and how she grew from it and how she learned from it. The interesting point that he makes about the problem of suffering is that people, they need the suffering. It's essential in their lives in order for them to call out for Christ and for the Lord and to have him work in them. C.S. Lewis said that God whispers to us in our joy, and he speaks to us, and he shouts in our pain, and it's his megaphone to the world. It is through our pains that God wakes us up. It's to shake us and arouse us and to remind us that without him we can do nothing. And he also mentions that it's only the most mature Christians that accept the suffering in their lives. The people who are making a big deal out of things and shouting and complaining, they're not the ones, they don't endure much suffering. You'll find that they haven't had to endure much in their lives, but the mature Christians who have had to go through a lot of suffering and who have had to endure much, they're the ones, they're content with their life because they know exactly what it's like to have the Lord in their life, and they welcome the suffering because they know that the long-term good that it brings them. What does theologian James Stewart add to this point? When asked why this is so, Kreeft elaborates on this topic using 2 examples. Please describe them and explain how they relate to the problem of suffering. And how does he use Job to further illustrate this point? The point, the point that was made is that love needs presence, and he said that because love needs presence, Job asked God, asked God, where are you, or who are you? And so God emphasized this point. God answers a question by answering with a question. He said, were you there when I laid down the foundations of the world? Were you there when I created mankind and I created everything? And Job, the answer was clearly no. So in essence, God was asking Job, who are you? So by taking everything away from Job, he felt the presence of God. And because he knew that God was there and he accepted the answer, and being a philosopher, Job could have kept on going back and forth and retaliating with God and asking questions, but he didn't. He accepted God's presence, and he knew that God was there, and God then blessed him with more than anything. He blessed him with beautiful daughters and land and much more than what Job had before. One of the examples was Romeo and Juliet. When Romeo, he says that if Romeo stabbed himself and he was gushing with wounds, but then Juliet awoke and looked at Romeo and said, Romeo, are you not alive? And then Romeo would be completely happy to know that Juliet is well and alive, despite the fact that he's sitting there with blood spewing out of his body. Another example is the 2 rabbis. When they were in the concentration camps, one of the rabbis was completely downtrodden, and he denounced God from his life, and he said, there is no God. I don't believe in God because of the fact that he let this happen to us. And another rabbi kept on praying to God daily, and he believed in God, and he just continued to have faith despite what was happening to them. And then he kept on having faith. He said, God will deliver us, God will deliver us. And the other rabbi was like, you fool, what are you praying for? God's not, look at what he's allowing these monsters to do to us. But then at the last minute, when they were about to enter the chambers, they were one right after the other, and the one who said, the one who had denounced God from the very beginning, as he was entering the gas chambers, he said, Lord, please deliver my soul. So initially, at the end, he ended up believing, and he stepped to the gas chambers having said, Lord, please deliver me. The other rabbi, though, right before he steps in, he said there is no God. He was the one that denounced God at the end, having lost complete faith and became completely empty of his faith. Now, what the first rabbi learned from his suffering, and he in the end, his suffering brought him closer to God, and he was able to say, Lord, please deliver me, and he had that faith in the end.